Hello, sixth graders. Today's video is about how to tell that a chemical change is happening instead of just a physical change in a science experiment. Signs or indicators of a chemical change. First of all, before we talk about what a chemical change is, it might be helpful to go over some examples of a physical change. A physical change is a change in the appearance of a thing, but not in its scientific properties. It would be good to pause the video now and write this into your word bank. Physical change. A change in the appearance of something, but not in its scientific properties. Some examples are things that we've talked about in science already this year. One example that we've already discussed is erosion. River rocks getting smoother or changing over time, or the rocks next to an ocean changing over time, eventually becoming sand, is a physical change. The rocks are not changing into something different, they're still rocks. Sand is very tiny particles of rock, but they are changing in their appearance. Another example we discussed in the food and nutrition unit, and that was the first step in the digestive process, which is chewing your food up into small pieces. Good advice for anyone who does not want to have indigestion. Mixing salt and water to make a solution is another example of a physical change. The salt and water together remain salt and water, and you can prove this by evaporating the water in an evaporating dish, and what you have is still salt. Another example that we've seen is melting ice or boiling water to make it evaporate. It's still H2O. Its chemical properties have not changed. They've just changed in their state of matter from a liquid to a solid in the case of freezing something, or from a solid to a liquid in case of melting something, and in this instance, changing into a gas, evaporation. So, what is a chemical change? Another thing you might want to stop the video for and write down into your word bank. A chemical change is putting two or more substances together to form a new substance with new properties. You can't reverse the process and go backwards and end up with the original substances. That's very important because you might think that salt and water mixed together form a new substance, but you can reverse the process by evaporating the water to give yourself the salt again, but with a chemical change you can't turn the process around. Here are some examples. One example is after you do the initial chewing of your food, which is a physical change, breaking it into small pieces, your food goes into your stomach where it is broken down by hydrochloric acid. This is an example of a chemical change. If this didn't happen, you would not be able to get nutrition from your food. A second example is the rusting of a car over a long period of time. Iron and oxygen, or water as well, can cause this to happen, will form iron oxide, which is known as rust. The Mentos reacting with Coke, well, after I did some research, I found that it's unclear whether this is a real reaction or not. It might just be the acceleration of the release of carbon dioxide that's already present in the Coke. But it's a possible science project if you want to study that as your science fair project in some way to investigate whether an actual chemical change is happening. So, to look for a chemical reaction, you need to know what to look for in order to tell whether there's a chemical reaction happening. What should you look for to show signs that a chemical change is happening, not just a physical change? Not all of these are necessarily going to happen. One thing that might happen, though, is there might be a color change when you mix two chemicals together if there is a chemical reaction. A very common thing that will happen is that a gas is created. There will be some fizzing or bubbling. Another common thing that will happen is that there will be a change in the temperature. It'll either get warmer or colder, but that may or may not happen. A very common thing that will happen in a chemical reaction is that a precipitate is formed. A precipitate is a new solid that settles to the bottom of the liquid. So when you mix two chemicals together and in a solution form, the new solid, which may or may not form a solution with the original liquid, becomes a precipitate. It slowly and very carefully sinks to the bottom, and it might form a chalky sort of substance at the bottom of your experiment. That's known as a precipitate, another good word to add to your word bank. You can pause the video now to do that. Another thing that might happen to show a chemical reaction is the change in the properties, which indicates that new substances are being made. There might be a change in smell, sight, touch, or the other indications of properties which we discussed before. And another thing that might happen in a chemical reaction is explosion or sudden fire. But don't get your hopes up for this science class, because we're not going to be working with any chemicals that should create an explosion or... Oh, wait! Oh my goodness! Oh, my computer is on fire. So I better get out of there. If you would like to, you can continue watching this video to see some indications of chemical change from a video created by Ed Hitchcock. And Ed has this video on YouTube, and you could watch for yourself if you would like. And if you search for it, it's called Indications of Chemical Change. He goes through a few examples which I can show you very briefly. Here's one example of color change and precipitate when lead nitrate and potassium iodide are mixed together. You can see that it's a precipitate because it's a solid that's slowly floating down to the bottom of the vial. Another example that he shows you is temperature change and the production of a gas when you add citric acid and baking soda together, which is something that you're going to do in class, so I'm not going to show you this one because I don't want you to know what happens with the temperature or with production of gas in that one. I'd like you to see for yourself. Another way for you to indicate or to discover whether there is the presence of oxygen being created, which, sorry, we're not going to do in our experiment, is by putting an ember into a combination of two chemicals to see if they're producing an oxygen. And you can see he's doing this here, and you can see what happens. He's got a match that's been burned out. He's going to light it again and try it again because this chemical reaction hadn't gotten far enough yet. But as you can see, when he puts it back in to the vial, it reignites, creates a fire again, which is an indicator that there's oxygen being created in this reaction. The oxygen is a very necessary component to fire, so it shows that there's a new source of oxygen right there. And here's a close-up in case you didn't see it the first time. And he's going to show you what everyone's favorite is, what everyone's favorite indication of a chemical reaction is, explosions. And here he's going to be using sodium, which, as I'd mentioned, is one of the ingredients of salt. Sodium chloride is salt, but as it occurs alone, it's definitely not edible. It's a metal, and he's going to add this to an unknown substance, I believe, so that you don't try this at home. And sodium can be very explosive, as you can see. Not something you would like to eat. Thank you very much for watching this, and good luck.